The roar of a Lamborghini engine ripped through the air, sending dust flying as Karen's son tore through my horse barn like it was his personal racetrack. Tires screeched, the metal of my fence bent under the reckless force, and my horses bolted in panic. The thrill on his face was clear. He thought he could do whatever he wanted, no consequences. But that was the moment I realized I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The battle for my home was about to escalate, and Karen was about to regret every move she made. Welcome back to Confessions of HOA. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe. I was standing at the fence of my horse barn, enjoying the quiet evening as the golden light of the setting sun bathed the paddocks in a warm glow. The horses were peacefully grazing, the air thick with the scent of hay and earth. It had been a long day, but in this moment, it felt like everything was just right. I'd worked hard to get here, to make this property a home. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My escape from the chaos of the world, a place where I could just breathe. Then, the peace shattered. The deafening roar of a Lamborghini engine cut through the silence like a knife, reverberating through the barn and making the horses stir. I turned instinctively, irritation blooming in my chest. The car screeched around the corner, tires squealing as it skidded across the gravel drive. My eyes narrowed as I recognized the driver, the son of Karen, the HOA president. I had seen him before, speeding around the neighborhood like he owned the place, but today, he was taking things to a new level. He gunned the engine again, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The car fishtailed wildly, veering dangerously close to the barn. It was clear he was showing off, treating the neighborhood like his own private racetrack. I watched in disbelief as he floored the accelerator, the sleek yellow Lamborghini shooting past me, barely missing the edge of the barn. The tires screeched, a sound that made my blood run cold, and for a split second, I thought it was going to crash into the fence. But the kid didn't stop there. He whipped the car around and came back for another pass, this time drifting so close that I could hear the squeal of the tires and see the dust rising in the wake of his reckless maneuvers. My horses, already spooked by the noise, were now panicked, running frantically along the far side of the paddock. I saw one of them stumble, slipping in the dirt, and I felt a surge of anger I hadn't experienced in years. I slammed my fist against the fence, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a matter of kids messing around. This was a blatant disregard for my property and my animals. I made my way toward the barn, a fire building inside me. But as I walked, I knew deep down this wasn't the first time this had happened. Karen's son had been pulling these stunts for months, flaunting his wealth and privilege like he could do whatever he wanted. The HOA had done nothing. Karen had done nothing. They were too busy focusing on trivial things like my landscaping choices or the position of my mailbox to address real issues. The power they held over my property, my rights, it was suffocating. I reached the front of the barn just as the Lamborghini roared past again, sending a shockwave of dust into my face. I could barely contain my fury now. The horses were still spooked, and I knew they wouldn't settle down until the kid was gone. I turned to head back inside, but as I did, I saw Karen's son throw me a mocking look as he sped away, a grin plastered on his face. Something inside me snapped. I had been patient for far too long, trying to take the high road. But this was the final straw. I couldn't just sit by and watch as they pushed me around anymore. The HOA had crossed a line. They had ignored my rights, abused their power, and now they were putting my property, my animals, at risk. And I knew exactly what I had to do. I've always been the kind of person who found peace in the simple things. Watching the sun rise over the trees, the soft whinny of a horse greeting the dawn, and the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt. Life wasn't complicated, not until I bought the barn. It wasn't just a barn. It was a dream come true. I had saved for years, working long hours, putting in the sweat and patience to afford the property I'd always wanted. A place where I could escape the grind, where I could feel the dirt under my feet and the wind in my hair, surrounded by the creatures I loved. The horses were more than just animals to me. They were my companions, my sense of calm in a world that too often felt like it was spiraling out of control. The barn itself was a bit worn down when I bought it, but nothing I couldn't fix. I'd spent weekends restoring the fencing, patching up the roof, and painting the old wood that had seen too many seasons come and go. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. Every morning, I'd get up early, feed the horses, clean the stalls, and watched the world slowly wake up. It was a rhythm I loved, a rhythm that made everything else fall into place. But as much as I had built this life for myself, something had always been looming in the background. Something I hadn't fully understood when I first moved in. That something was the HOA. At first, I thought the HOA was just a formality, a group of people who made sure the neighborhood kept up appearances. I never expected them to get involved in my day-to-day life. I thought they would focus on things like trash pickup and maybe a few rules about lawns and fences. I wasn't exactly worried until I met Karen. Karen was the HOA president, and she wasn't the kind of person you'd easily forget. She had this air of entitlement about her, a sense that she was always right, always in control, and that everyone else had to fall in line. I first met her when she came knocking on my door, her heels clicking against the pavement like a judge entering a courtroom. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of smile that's more about sizing you up than about being friendly. "We have some concerns," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She glanced around, as if inspecting the place. "You see, the HOA has some rules about property upkeep, and we noticed a few things." She pointed to my fence, my horses, the way the barn looked as if it had been lived in for decades. "It's not exactly up to standard." I tried to keep my cool. "The barn's fine, and the horses are well taken care of," I said, my voice steady. "I don't think there's any issue here." But Karen wasn't having it. She launched into a list of regulations I'd never seen. Things about fences that couldn't be too high, the color of my barn that clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic, and the way my property looked a little too rustic for her taste. It was overwhelming, but I was determined to stand my ground. "I'm happy to discuss any issues you have, but this is my property," I said, the words coming out more firm than I'd intended. Karen didn't like being challenged, not in the least. She crossed her arms, looking down her nose at me. "The HOA represents the community, and it's our job to ensure everything is up to code. It's for the good of everyone, you know." That was the moment I realized. Karen wasn't interested in my property or my rights. She was interested in control. She didn't want a neighbor. She wanted someone who would obey. And that realization, that slow creeping awareness that I wasn't just up against a few minor rules, but the very notion of what she thought was acceptable, hit me like a ton of bricks. For weeks after that, the HOA kept sending me letters, making complaints, trying to force me to change things that didn't need changing. My barn had become a target, and Karen was the one pulling the strings. She'd send me documents, codes, and regulations that I had no interest in, all under the guise of improving my property. I thought about fighting back, but it felt like it was always just one thing after another, and I was too busy keeping the place running, too busy with my horses, to deal with her petty demands. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go. And that's when the Lamborghini incident happened. The son of the HOA president, of all people, speeding around my barn, endangering my animals, and disrespecting everything I had worked so hard for. That was the final straw. It wasn't just a small nuisance anymore. It was a clear message from Karen and the HOA. They could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and I was supposed to just accept it. But things were about to get a lot worse. The more I tried to stay out of it, the deeper I was dragged in. The knock on my door came early one afternoon, just as I was finishing up some repairs on the barn door. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. That same familiar feeling of dread hit me in the chest, and I already knew I wasn't going to like what was coming. I opened the door, and there she was, Karen, with her ever so polite, almost insincere smile plastered on her face. She looked like she'd stepped out of some corporate boardroom rather than a suburban neighborhood. Her dark sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose, and she had that air of someone who expected you to stand up and listen the moment she spoke. "Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you about some concerns the HOA has with your property," she said, as if I had invited her in. She barely waited for me to respond before pushing her way inside. I stood there, half in shock, as she walked into my living room without so much as a glance back. The audacity was staggering, but I held my tongue. I'd dealt with people like her before, always a little too eager to exert their power, always a little too comfortable in their privilege. "Is this about the fence again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I had made a few adjustments recently to the boundary line, but I was sure everything was still within the HOA's guidelines. "No, it's not about the fence," Karen replied, with a dismissive wave of her hand. Though, honestly, I should have addressed that months ago. She paused for dramatic effect, watching my face, perhaps expecting some sort of apology. But that's not the issue today. It's the barn. I blinked. The barn. Yes, the barn, she repeated, her tone sharp now. It's too close to the property line. The HOA's rules clearly state that any structure within 10 feet of the boundary needs to be approved before construction, and that barn was built. What? 3 feet from the line. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. My barn had been here long before the HOA ever got its hands on this neighborhood. But I knew arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. It's been here for decades. It's not like I just put it up last week. Doesn't matter, she said, as if I were missing the point. The rules are the rules. And frankly, your barn is a bit of an eyesore too. It's not in keeping with the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood. We've gotten complaints. From who? I asked, already knowing the answer. It was always the same few people, those who had nothing better to do than complain about someone else's property. She flipped through her folder, though I could tell the papers inside were mostly for show. There are multiple reports. Several residents have expressed concerns. It doesn't match the standard we're trying to uphold here. The HOA is about community, and the barn, frankly, is sticking out like a sore thumb. I stood there, trying to process what she was saying. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. She was telling me that my barn, the very thing that had made this place feel like home to me, wasn't good enough. She was telling me it didn't belong. I've kept it in good shape. The horses are well cared for. I don't see how it's causing anyone any trouble, I said, my voice a little firmer now. If people have concerns, they can come talk to me directly. That's not how it works, Karen said sharply. The HOA does all the talking. You're just here to comply. Her words hit me harder than I expected. The more she spoke, the more it became clear, this wasn't just a minor issue. This wasn't just about rules or complaints. This was about control. She wasn't here to fix a problem. She was here to remind me who was in charge. And that, above everything else, made my blood boil. Listen, I'm not here to get into a long discussion about this, she said, standing up and gathering her papers. I've already scheduled a community meeting next week, and this will be on the agenda. You're welcome to attend, of course, but I suggest you start making arrangements to bring your property into compliance. The door swung open behind her, and she looked at me one last time, that same calculating look in her eyes. You don't want this to escalate, she added, almost like a threat. I wanted to tell her where she could shove her HOA rules, but I knew better. I nodded, holding back my anger. I'll be there, I said, my voice low. She smiled, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something almost triumphant in her eyes. Good. I'll see you at the meeting. As she left, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just a simple complaint anymore. Karen wasn't playing around, and neither was I. She'd crossed a line, and I knew it. I wasn't going to just sit back and let her steamroll me. This was going to be a fight. The days after the meeting felt like a slow build-up of tension, the kind you feel in your bones before a storm. Karen hadn't let up, not even for a second. The first letter arrived just days after she'd left my house, each line dripping with authority. It was a formal notice from the HOA, citing non-compliance with their property standards. The barn, the fence, the paint, everything was now under scrutiny, all of it conveniently listed under violations that were non-negotiable. The letter felt like a slap in the face. What really got under my skin, though, was the fine. A hefty sum that felt less like a fine and more like an extortion payment, meant to punish, to push me into submission. I'd seen HOA fines before, but this one was different. It was personal. She was making sure I knew it. I could almost hear her smug voice in my head, reading the letter out loud. You will have 30 days to rectify these violations or face further action, including additional fines and legal proceedings. I sat down at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me, staring at the bold print, my fingers gripping the edge. A familiar frustration began to bubble up inside me. This wasn't about the barn or the fence. It was about control. Karen had seen an opportunity to flex her muscle, to remind all of us, that she had the power. And she wasn't going to stop until she broke me. It wasn't just that letter. Over the next few weeks, they came, more letters, more fines, more nitpicking about every minor detail. The color of my mailbox, the placement of a garden hose, Even the way the windmill in my yard tilted slightly to the left. Every day, there was something new, something designed to chip away at my patience. One evening, as I was finishing up in the barn, I noticed a couple of neighbors standing outside across the street, whispering to each other and pointing in my direction. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but I knew what it meant. Karen had already started her campaign to turn the community against me. She'd found a way to make it seem like I was the problem. My barn, my horses, my property, all of it was a nuisance now. She had turned my dream into something they all saw as a burden. And that was when the realization hit me. I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. I was fighting an entire system, a system that had already chosen a side. I was the outsider now, the one who didn't fit into the neat little box of suburban perfection. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association, it was a force. And it wasn't going to be satisfied until I was broken, until I gave in to their demands. The fines and complaints kept piling up. They were suffocating, relentless. And the worst part? I could feel myself starting to crack. The thought of just selling the place, walking away from everything I'd worked for, started to creep into my mind. Maybe it would be easier. Maybe I could just wash my hands of it all and move on. But no, I couldn't. Every time Karen showed up with a new complaint, or one of her little minions dropped off another stack of papers, I could feel my resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about a barn. This wasn't just about a fence or a mailbox. This was about my right to live my life without being bullied by someone who had more power than they deserved. I knew I had to fight back, but I wasn't going to be impulsive about it. I had to play this smart, step by step. First, I needed to document everything. Every letter, every fine, every single interaction with the HOA. I started taking photographs, keeping notes, cataloging each violation they accused me of. If I was going to take them on, I had to be prepared. I wasn't going to let them win with their endless paperwork and empty threats. I was going to use their rules against them. But I also needed to find allies. I wasn't the only one who had to deal with Karen's overreach. There had to be others in the neighborhood who were tired of the constant meddling, tired of the way Karen ran things with an iron fist. I started reaching out, talking to neighbors when I could. A few of them opened up, hesitant at first, but once they realized I wasn't backing down, they started sharing their own frustrations. A couple of them had even faced similar fines, minor violations that had been blown out of proportion just to make them comply. As the weeks passed, I began to realize the full scope of what I was up against. It wasn't just Karen. It was the whole system she controlled. Every legal threat, every fine, every little complaint was part of a larger game she was playing. She wasn't going to stop until she had broken me, until I bent to her will. But little did I know, the real battle hadn't even begun. For the next few days, I stayed in the barn. Not literally, but mentally. Every inch of that property became a battleground, and I knew I couldn't afford to waste time. The constant stream of HOA complaints, the mounting fines, Karen's subtle threats, it all started to feel like a well-oiled machine designed to wear me down. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not like this. I started by collecting everything. Every letter, every email, every little note or flyer they'd sent me. I filed them in neat, chronological order, each one more ridiculous than the last. The first couple of violations were easy to dismiss. Minor, nitpicky stuff, like the angle of my mailbox. But as time went on, the complaints escalated. They were getting bolder, more personal, pushing the boundaries of what I could tolerate. If Karen thought I would just roll over, she was sorely mistaken. I knew it wasn't enough just to document the complaints. Karen had the HOA's backing, and I couldn't take her on with just a stack of papers. I needed to bring in some firepower, someone who understood the legal side of things. That's when I reached out to a local attorney, someone who had experience dealing with HOA disputes. When I met him, he didn't waste any time. He was sharp, quick to analyze the situation, and didn't sugarcoat things. "You're not the first person they've done this to, and you won't be the last," he said, flipping through the stack of fines I'd given him. "The HOA has a lot of power, but they're not above the law. You've got options, but you'll have to be strategic. You can't just keep letting them push you around." It was exactly what I needed to hear. My mind was already spinning with ideas, but hearing it from someone who knew the ins and outs of the legal system grounded me. We talked for over an hour, discussing my rights as a property owner, the potential for countersuits, and the long, drawn-out battle I could expect if I decided to fight. Karen might have thought she could intimidate me, but this attorney gave me a glimpse of something I hadn't had before, a plan. I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to come at me. I was going to fight back with the law on my side. Every document I gathered became ammunition. Every conversation I had with the neighbors who were tired of Karen's antics, valuable intelligence. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about standing up to Karen. This was about setting a precedent. If I let them get away with this, if I just let them trample on my rights without a fight, it wouldn't stop with me. They'd move on to someone else, someone who might not have the resources, the patience, or the will to stand up to them. This wasn't just my fight. It was for everyone who had been silenced, who had been forced to comply with Karen's whims. I started drafting responses to the HOA's complaints. Every letter, every fine, I shot back with evidence. Your claims are unfounded. Your demands are unreasonable. I reminded them, with each response, that I knew my rights, that I wasn't just going to take their word for it, that I had a plan. But all of this preparation, all of this strategy, was just the calm before the storm. I knew the moment was coming. I could feel it in my gut. The meeting that Karen had set up, the one where she would try to publicly shame me, the one where she'd bring down the full weight of the HOA on me, expecting me to fold. But I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't afford to. Everything I'd done so far had been just a warm-up. The real game was about to begin. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a sterile, almost clinical building that somehow still managed to feel suffocating. The room was filled with folding chairs arranged in neat rows, but the air was thick with tension. I walked in, my shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, and took a seat near the back. There were murmurs among the crowd, the usual mix of people who were either too scared or too complacent to challenge Karen and the HOA. I was the odd one out, the troublemaker, the one who dared to stand up. Karen was already at the front of the room, sitting behind a table stacked with papers. She had that look on her face, the one that said, "I'm in control." She was speaking to a small group of the HOA members, her voice low and commanding. As I watched her, I could feel my blood start to simmer. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment where everything that had been building up inside me finally came to a head. She glanced up, noticing me sitting there, and for a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Maybe she expected me to cower, to back down in front of the crowd. Maybe she thought I'd crumble under the weight of her authority. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I'd come prepared. The meeting was called to order, and Karen stood up, straightening her blouse and speaking in that polished tone she used when she wanted to appear above everyone else. "We are here today to discuss several ongoing issues with Mr. Walker's property," she said, nodding in my direction. "As you all know, Mr. Walker has failed to comply with our regulations despite multiple attempts to resolve the matter amicably." I stood up, interrupting her before she could continue. The room fell silent, the eyes of the neighbors turning toward me. Karen's eyes narrowed, but I didn't back down. I had every right to be heard. "I think it's important to clarify a few things," I said, my voice steady. "First, I've complied with every request you've made within reason. Second, the so-called violations you keep citing aren't even violations in the legal sense. I've spoken to my attorney about your constant harassment, and let's just say, we're about to have a very different conversation." There was a collective intake of breath from the room, and Karen's face tightened, her mouth curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness, "I understand you're upset, but you're mistaken. This isn't harassment. This is the HOA doing its job to maintain the integrity of the community. I think you're doing more than that," I shot back. "You're abusing your power to force people into submission, to intimidate them into compliance. And that ends today." The room was now on edge. Karen didn't like being challenged, not in front of the others. But I could see the cracks in her facade. She wasn't as confident as she'd been a few moments ago. I continued, letting the words flow out, the evidence I'd gathered now backing me up. "I've got a copy of the community bylaws here," I said, pulling a folder from my bag. "And I've marked the sections that are relevant to my property and the complaints you've filed. You'll notice that the so-called violations you've claimed are not only exaggerated, but in many cases, outright false." I slid a few documents across the table, the sound of the papers sliding like a subtle but sharp warning. Karen's eyes flicked down to the papers, her fingers briefly twitching as she scanned them. I could see her face faltering, just for a moment, before she regained her composure. "You've consulted with an attorney," Karen said, her voice a little more clipped now. And what exactly do you think this will accomplish? You can't just ignore the rules, Mr. Walker. The HOA holds the power here. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the edge of the table. The HOA holds power, yes, I agreed. But so does every property owner in this community. You don't get to bully people just because you don't like how they live. If you think I'm going to roll over and let you push me around, you're mistaken. Karen's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing further. This isn't over, you know, she said, standing up straighter, her posture rigid. You can argue all you want, but we have the law on our side. You'll find that out soon enough. I'm not here to argue, Karen, I said, the words coming out calm, deliberate. I'm here to make sure you understand one thing. This community belongs to all of us, not just you, and I'm done letting you trample on my rights. For a moment, she just stared at me, her fingers drumming against the table. Then she took a deep breath, her lips curling into a forced smile again. Well, Mr. Walker, we'll see just how far your little legal strategy gets you. But don't expect me to back down. I stood my ground, holding her gaze. Karen wasn't going to back down easily, but I had a card to play that she didn't see coming. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. The battle lines were drawn now. This wasn't just a minor dispute anymore. It was war. The moment I left that meeting, I knew things were going to get worse. Karen didn't take well to being challenged. She was the type of person who thought she could control everything around her, and I just cracked that facade. I wasn't naive. I knew retaliation was inevitable, but I hadn't anticipated how far she was willing to go. It started small at first. I began receiving anonymous letters, each one more hostile than the last. The first was a note pinned to my barn door. You're not welcome here. It was handwritten, crude, and unsettling in its simplicity. The next one was a little more creative. Your animals are a nuisance. They'll be fine once they're gone. At first, I thought it was just an isolated incident, maybe even a prank. But then the complaints started coming in. Not official ones, but whispers. Neighbors crossing the street when they saw me, averting their gaze when I tried to wave. I could feel the tension in the air, like the community was turning against me, one glance at a time. Karen's influence was spreading, and I had no idea how far it would go. Then came the real push. Karen filed another formal complaint, this time with the local zoning department. This wasn't a small issue anymore. The letter I received threatened an official investigation into my property's zoning and use. If the zoning department found anything out of line, anything, no matter how minor, I was facing serious fines or possibly losing my property altogether. It was clear that Karen had her fingers in every possible pie, pulling strings behind the scenes to make sure I was cornered. The battle had moved beyond the HOA. She was going after me in every direction. But she wasn't done yet. Word around the neighborhood was that Karen had launched a full-fledged smear campaign. At first, I didn't think much of it. Gossip was always a part of any neighborhood. But the stories that started to spread were more than just whispers. They were personal. The rumors ranged from me neglecting my animals to me being some kind of troublemaker who didn't belong in the community. There were even reports, fabricated, of course, about complaints from other neighbors I'd never even met, all tied back to Karen's influence. One evening, as I was tending to the horses, I caught a glimpse of someone standing near the street, watching me. At first, I thought it was just another curious neighbor, but when they saw me looking, they quickly turned and walked away. I had been the subject of enough rumors by now to know it wasn't just curiosity, it was surveillance. Karen's eyes were everywhere. And the thing that stung the most? I didn't even have to be a part of this to see how much damage was being done. The HOA had turned me into a pariah, the outsider who was now a problem for the entire neighborhood. Still, I kept my head down. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. I started gathering more evidence, taking notes on every interaction, every letter, every offhand comment made by neighbors who had fallen under Karen's spell. But despite my best efforts, it was clear I wasn't going to escape this easily. I had to face what was coming head-on. The final blow came one morning when I woke up to find my barn's main gate completely defaced. Someone had spray-painted over the front in large, bold letters, "Threat to Community." My heart sank as I stood there, staring at the vandalism. Whoever did this wasn't just sending a message, they were sending a threat. The message was clear. I was no longer just a nuisance to Karen. I was an enemy. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the situation press in on me. The game had changed. This wasn't just about legal battles or community meetings anymore. This was personal. Karen had made sure of that. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her turn my dream into her playground. But if I thought things were bad before, the next twist would shake me to my core. It was clear now that Karen wouldn't stop until I was out of the picture, no matter what it took. And if I was going to survive this, I had to fight smarter, because this was just the beginning of something much, much bigger. The days following the vandalism felt like a turning point, though I still had no idea how deep Karen's grip on this neighborhood really ran. But I wasn't going to back down. Not anymore. The more she pushed, the more determined I became to push back. And this time, I had a plan. I had spent the last few weeks collecting evidence. Everything from photos of the vandalism to the legal advice I'd gotten from my attorney. But now, I was moving from defense to offense. The first part of my strategy was simple: hit them where it hurt. Legally, I filed a formal complaint with the local authorities about the vandalism. It wasn't just graffiti, it was defamation, an act of intimidation designed to force me out. I made sure to gather as much documentation as possible. Photos of the spray-painted gate, witness statements from a couple of neighbors who had seen the damage, and copies of all the HOA's violation letters. I wasn't just going to roll over. I was going to make sure Karen and her little network felt the weight of their own actions. The second part of the strategy was more subtle, but just as effective: public exposure. I knew I had to bring this issue to light, to show the community what was really going on behind closed doors. It wasn't just about my barn or a few minor violations anymore. It was about power, Karen's abuse of it, and how far she was willing to go to control the lives of people in this neighborhood. So, I reached out to a local news outlet that had been covering similar stories of HOA overreach in other communities. I wasn't sure how they'd respond, but I knew this was the kind of story they'd want to hear. The reporter I spoke to was interested right away, and within days, a piece was published online. It didn't just cover my situation. It painted a broader picture of how HOAs, particularly Karen's, were creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in the neighborhood. The article quoted a few of my neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before, but were now willing to share their own stories of frustration. It even included details about the illegal fine system Karen had been running, how she'd been selectively enforcing rules to harass certain residents while letting others slide. The article went viral in the local community, and soon, people who had been silent were starting to speak out. The backlash against Karen was immediate. People started showing up at her HOA meetings, confronting her about her actions. Neighbors who had been afraid to stand up before now found their voices. The tides were turning. I could see it in the way Karen carried herself. She wasn't the confident, untouchable leader she once was. She was rattled, but there was still the legal side of things to deal with. I was holding steady with my attorney's help, carefully navigating the lawsuit I'd filed against the HOA. It wasn't just about the fines anymore. It was about how Karen had used her position to personally attack me. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. Other homeowners who had been victims of Karen's personal vendettas, all the way back to when she first took office. I was compiling evidence of abuse of power, and it was slowly starting to add up. The situation was escalating on both sides. Karen retaliated with more legal threats, trying to intimidate me into dropping the lawsuit. She even tried to discredit the news article, calling it a smear campaign. But each attempt only dug her hole deeper. She had underestimated the ripple effect. The more she fought back, the more people saw her true colors. The neighbors were beginning to rally behind me, and it felt like the walls she'd built around herself were finally crumbling. I took a moment to appreciate the progress, but I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't going to back down easily. If anything, she was going to double down, push harder, and try to regain control. But what she didn't know was that I was already steps ahead. Every move she made only gave me more ammunition, more fuel for the fire. Karen didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. I never expected Karen's overreach to come back to haunt her in the way it did, but that was the moment everything changed. It started on a Wednesday afternoon. I had been preparing for a small legal meeting with my attorney when I got an unexpected email, an invitation to a meeting with a local group, the Neighborhood Integrity Coalition. I had never heard of them before, but the email was from one of my neighbors, someone I'd spoken to briefly about the smear campaign Karen had launched against me. Her name was Linda, and she'd been a quiet ally, too afraid to speak up in public, but willing to talk when we were alone. The email read like a plea for help. "We've had enough. We can't let Karen run this neighborhood into the ground. If you're interested, we need your voice on our side. Let's meet and discuss what we can do together." Something about it struck me, the fact that Linda and a few others had come together, organizing quietly, behind Karen's back. I was still digesting what that meant when I showed up at the meeting later that evening. The room was small, only about a dozen neighbors gathered, but the energy was palpable. People whispered excitedly as I walked in, and Linda gave me a knowing smile. "You're not the only one she's targeted," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "There are a lot of us who've had enough of Karen's manipulation." As the meeting unfolded, I learned that this small group of neighbors had been quietly gathering evidence of Karen's abuses over the years, things the HOA had been covering up. The group was made up of former HOA members who had been pushed out by Karen's authoritarian rule, some residents who'd suffered fines or violations under dubious circumstances, and even a few longtime community members who had never wanted to get involved but were fed up with Karen's stranglehold on the neighborhood. Then came the bombshell. One of the former HOA members, a woman named Mary, handed me a thick folder. It was filled with documents, emails, and notes. At first glance, it looked like any other set of HOA paperwork. But as I flipped through it, I saw something shocking. Among the emails and memos, there was a series of communications between Karen and a developer. They were discussing plans to convert part of the neighborhood into a commercial property, a move that would not only devastate the value of the homes, but also go against everything the HOA was supposed to be protecting. The twist hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen hadn't just been abusing her power over personal properties. She'd been trying to sell out the entire neighborhood, all for her own gain. The land I'd fought for, the barn I'd worked on tirelessly, was part of a much bigger game. Karen had been colluding with a developer to profit from a major real estate deal that would change the very landscape of our community. I could feel my heart racing as I absorbed the magnitude of what was in front of me. This wasn't just about a few fines or petty complaints anymore. Karen had been playing a much bigger game, and I had the evidence to take her down. Linda leaned in, her voice urgent. "This is bigger than us. It's bigger than the HOA. She's been using the association as a front to push this development project through, and the whole thing's been under the radar. But if we make this public, if we expose her..." I didn't need to hear more. My mind was already racing, running through the possibilities. The legal ramifications, the media coverage, the way this could blow up in Karen's face. I had what I needed to finally turn the tide. The group agreed to keep meeting in secret, working quietly to gather more evidence and get their story out. But I knew I couldn't sit on this information for long. I had to act, and I had to act fast. That night, I sat down with my attorney, my mind still buzzing with everything I'd just learned. "We've got her," I said, handing over the documents. "This is our key to taking Karen down once and for all." My attorney's eyes widened as he sifted through the pages. "This is a game changer," he said quietly. "This isn't just a violation of HOA rules. This is fraud. She's been operating this HOA with the intent to profit, which means everything she's done up until now could be considered illegal." The weight of it sank in. The fight I'd been waging with Karen was small potatoes compared to what was coming. This was no longer just about me or my barn. This was about exposing corruption, standing up for the community, and taking down someone who had abused their power for far too long. As the days passed, I filed everything with the proper authorities, ensuring the developer's communications and Karen's involvement in the scheme were front and center. The more I dug, the more connections I found, links to financial transactions, backdoor deals, and everything in between. I knew Karen would retaliate. She would try to bury the story, use her power to silence anyone who dared speak up. But she didn't know it yet. This was the moment everything had changed. With that one move, everything I'd been working toward had finally clicked into place. Karen wasn't going to walk away from this one, and I wasn't going to let her. The moment had finally arrived. After months of build-up, legal battles, and strategic planning, I was standing face to face with Karen once again. But this time, everything was different. I wasn't the quiet neighbor trying to keep the peace. I wasn't the one being bullied into submission. This time, I was in control. The community center was packed. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with every passing minute as more neighbors filed in. This was it, the public showdown, the final confrontation. Karen had called for another HOA meeting, but I knew better. This wasn't just a meeting. This was her last attempt to salvage her power, to make sure she could still control the neighborhood. And I was going to make sure that didn't happen. Karen stood at the front of the room, looking as poised as ever. She wore that same practice smile, the one she used when she wanted to appear like she had everything under control. She glanced at me as I walked in, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, something she was trying to hide beneath that mask of confidence. I'd been expecting that. The room was tense. People were whispering, glancing at me, some with uncertainty, others with curiosity. I could feel their eyes on me, but I kept my focus on Karen. This was it. The moment where everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, was going to come to a head. Karen opened the meeting with the same tired rhetoric, her voice smooth and condescending. As we all know, there's been she paused, the word disruption hanging in the air like a curse, concerning issues with Mr. Walker's property. His refusal to comply with the HOA's regulations has caused unnecessary tension in the community. I could already feel the crowd turning, their attention shifting toward me. She was trying to spin the narrative, to paint me as the troublemaker. But she wasn't going to get away with it this time. I stood up, cutting her off before she could continue. I think it's time we clarify exactly what's been happening here, I said, my voice calm but unwavering. The room fell silent. Every eye was on me. For months now, I've been fighting to protect my property from your overreach, Karen. You've used your position to harass me, fine me for nonsensical reasons, and even resorted to vandalizing my property. But I'm not the only one you've targeted. I could feel Karen's unease, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She was starting to lose that air of control. I've gathered evidence, I continued, pulling out a stack of documents from my briefcase. Not just about the fines you've levied against me, but about the real agenda you've been hiding from this community. You've been working with a developer to sell off part of this neighborhood for a commercial development project. And that, Karen, is where you've crossed the line. The room gasped. I could see the shock in their faces, but it was too late. The truth was out. I laid the evidence on the table for all to see. Emails, contracts, proof of meetings between Karen and the developer. The room was buzzing now, the whispers growing louder. Karen was stiff, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. I could almost feel her trying to recover, to put on the same act she had before. But it was no use. Don't you dare, Karen finally spoke, her voice shaking with fury. Try to turn this into some sort of conspiracy. You don't have the proof. I have everything I need. I interrupted, my tone sharp. And so does the community. I've already sent copies of this evidence to the local authorities and the press. You can try to spin this any way you want, but the truth is out now. People are talking, and they're not going to let you get away with it. I could see her face redden, her lips tightening into a thin line. She had underestimated me, thought she could control the narrative and manipulate the people around her. But I had outplayed her. The game was no longer in her hands. Let's be clear, I said, leaning forward, locking eyes with her. You've used your position for personal gain, and you've tried to run this community with fear and manipulation. Well, those days are over. Karen tried to speak again, but I cut her off. The real question is, Karen, do you think you can keep controlling everyone? Or is this the moment where your reign ends? The room was silent. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. She was powerless. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I turned to the crowd, my voice steady. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. We deserve a community where we're not afraid to speak up, where we're not bullied into compliance. And if we stand together, Karen's reign of terror is over. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence deafening. But then, slowly, people started to stand. One by one, they nodded in agreement. It wasn't just me anymore. The neighborhood was finally waking up, finally realizing that they didn't have to live in fear of someone like Karen. Karen's face turned pale as she realized she had lost. There was no spin, no way to twist the situation in her favor anymore. The truth had come to light, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The game was finally over. But what did I really win? The victory was sweeter than I ever imagined. But as I looked around at my neighbors, at the faces of those who had stood up with me, I realized this wasn't just my victory. This was ours. And Karen? She was done. The dust had finally settled, But the aftermath of everything that had happened still lingered in the air. I stood on my property, the barn just behind me, and took a deep breath. The victory was mine, yes. But there was no rush of triumph, no feeling of revenge, just a quiet sense of relief. The battle was over, and I had won. But at what cost? It hadn't been an easy fight. In the beginning, it felt like I was fighting not just against Karen, but against a whole system. A system that was designed to keep people like me in line. The HOA had taken more than my peace of mind. It had taken my sense of security, my belief that I could live in my own home without being watched, without being punished for something as simple as owning a horse. And it wasn't just the fines, the legal threats, or the vandalism. It was the constant erosion of my rights, the sense that I had to prove myself every step of the way just to keep what was mine. The emotional toll had been heavier than I expected. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if it was all worth it. The anxiety, the tension, it weighed on me, draining my energy. There were times when I thought about giving up, about selling the property and walking away. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I couldn't let someone like Karen win. Not after everything I had fought for, not after everything I had built. But what did I gain from all of this? Sure, I had exposed the truth. I had stood up to an authority that thought it could control me, and I had taken back what was mine. But it wasn't just about the legal victories or the community support. It was about something deeper. I had learned something about myself through this process. Something I hadn't fully realized until it was over. Patience, for one, and resilience. I thought I was just fighting for my property, for my right to live without interference. But in the end, I was fighting for my own peace of mind, for the integrity of the life I had chosen to build. I had learned that there are times when you have to stand up, even when it feels like the world is against you. And sometimes, the best way to fight back isn't with anger or force. It's with patience, strategy, and the courage to see it through. The community had rallied behind me, and that was the most rewarding part of all this. People who had been too scared to speak up had finally found their voices. Together, we'd shown Karen that power doesn't belong to the few, it belongs to everyone. And while Karen may have thought she was untouchable, she learned the hard way that there are consequences to abusing that power. Now, things were quieter. The complaints stopped coming. The fines were lifted. The community started to rebuild, to recover from the fear and manipulation that had held it hostage for so long. The barn was still standing, the horses still grazing in the fields. And though I knew there would always be challenges, I also knew I had the strength to face them. But as I stood there, looking at everything I had fought for, I realized something else. This victory was bigger than I'd thought. It wasn't just about me or my barn. It was about all of us. It was about standing up to the injustices that happen in the dark, about finding the courage to say no when the world tells you to be quiet. I'd won, yes. But in the end, the real victory was the change we'd created together. And as I looked out over my property, I knew this wasn't the end. There would always be new battles to fight, new challenges to face. But now, I had a whole community behind me. And that, in itself, was enough to keep going. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could control your life, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. And if you want to hear more stories of everyday people standing up for their rights, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's always more to come.